Well, this next story has caused a lot of conversation in our newsroom. A woman in America living with HIV has apparently been cured. The patient was actually being treated for leukemia. She reportedly received a stem cell transplant from someone with natural resistance to the virus. Scientists, part of this groundbreaking study, caution, though, that this treatment is not generally viable for the over 37 million people living with HIV. Well, let's go now to Professor Linda-Gail Bekker and her take on this. Linda-Gail, Prof, thank you so much for your time. It's been welcomed by the International AIDS Society, but with caution.
That's right, eNCA. You know, we know that the world really desperately wants to see a cure for HIV, particularly those 38 million living with the virus. But unfortunately, whilst this gives us hope that it's possible, and it certainly helps us tease out what is key in a cure, really stem cell transplant for the vast majority of people is going to just be one step too far. It really is, it's grueling treatment. And so, you know, it's not going to be something we're going to just be able to roll out to everyone.
Linda-Gail, the article I read in the Guardian said it was a very important patient in particular because she was a woman of, in America, they would say mixed race, and it was a woman, which was unusual. And the reason why the mixed race issue was important is because so many people who donate to bone marrow transplant centers are Caucasian. And that's why it was actually surprising that there was this match from an umbilical cord and it wasn't rejected.
Yeah, so, you know, as somebody described in one of the reports, and I thought it was really true, that, you know, the umbilical cord blood is sort of magic in a way. It needs to allow tolerance of this new little baby, the fetus, and so it has some forgiveness. Now, a lot of the time when we have bone marrow transplants, our own immune systems fight back. They don't like something foreign coming into our bodies, and this is the wonderful thing about our immunity, but sometimes it can play in a negative direction, and that we call graft versus host disease. In other words, the actual bone marrow that you're having to save your life is seen as an enemy by your immune system, and there's a kind of fight back. And it has been thought in the other two cases in which this cure has occurred that that kind of fight back was part of the solution or the part of the process of becoming a cure. What this lady shows is that using the cord blood meant that there was far less graft versus host disease, which meant it was more tolerable, which I think is also very encouraging. And it does mean that this opens up the option for this kind of treatment to many more, because it's easier to find a match to cord blood than it is to bone marrow per se. And you're absolutely right, we don't have enough people representing all demographies and all genders to step forward for transplants. And it's very important that that match is done very carefully to avoid this graft versus host disease, which in itself can cause incredible illness and even, you know, death ultimately.
So the stem cell transplant prevented the resurgence of the virus. Is it correct to use the word cure?
Yeah, so this is always the big question in cure research. On the one hand, we talk about long-term remission, a little bit like cancer, where, you know, you've had cancer, you're a cancer survivor, but lurking in the back of your mind is, you know, that cancer could come back at any time. And to a certain extent, we also apply that to HIV in this setting. You're very well suppressed. We can't easily find the virus, but is that virus still lurking somewhere? Now, this woman has been off treatment for 14 months. She hasn't needed her antiretrovirals. I suspect that the people looking after her have looked very hard for the virus. In other words, biopsies, lots of blood taking, really looked very hard for the virus. They've not seen it. And then we start to think about this could be a sterilized cure. In other words, we have eradicated every virus from that individual's body. But there is a bit of a spectrum, and I imagine she's still going to be followed for some time just to make sure that we actually have eradicated the virus in her.
Prof, quick last question. If I was HIV positive and I had the financial means and the will here in South Africa, could I get this treatment?
Annika, I would say not, because unless you got another reason to have this very grueling treatment. So this woman developed leukemia. The other two cases similarly developed a blood cancer, and that warranted them having this, as I say, quite radical invasive therapy. I don't think we would just do it in somebody living with the virus. That would be, the risk-benefit ratio there would be hard to really condone. But if you were facing leukemia, then certainly this is something we could do in this country. We do bone marrow transplants for blood cancers. And, you know, I think it's something we could indeed do. We've certainly led the way in many other areas of HIV medicine, and I can't imagine why we couldn't do it here.
Our COVID, HIV, our medical everything superstar. That was Professor Linda-Gail Bekker. Thanks so much, Linda-Gail.